Afterlife, Detention, or The Haunting of Bill Foreman by Joel T. Connors. The battered old car trundled down the school's pothole-laden car park as the rain lashed down on the windshield. Behind the steering wheel, Bill Foreman was secretly delighted about the rain. For the past month, the only things he had to care about were the flowers and vegetables he was growing in the cramped space he had for a garden. The only blight on this morning was the noise. It seemed to be the screams of children playing on the other side of the school, fairly loudly and unusual for rainy weather. As the day went on, the clouds dissipated and the children enjoyed the crisp, wet air and the dryness, even if they didn't notice it specifically as they went about their business. For Mr. Foreman, the evaporating puddles left behind dry disappointment. Teaching geography all day, he had made the mistake of giving all his students the same deadline for their homework. Evening was setting in, and Bill took the quiet time to sit at his desk and mark the drivel that had been passed to him throughout the day. Scribbling "Brexit is not a person" on Luke Wilton's homework, he looked up from his desk in exasperation. Bill was sitting in the light of a single lamp, but he could make out a figure standing in the corridor. "Yes, what is it? What do you want?" Bill barked at the child in the corridor, barely acknowledging him. Nothing. He looked back up at the open door. Nothing. He got up and looked out, down both ends of the corridor. Nothing. Nobody. No sound other than distant screams, probably coming from the field past the car park. He turned back into his classroom and slipped, catching the doorframe. "Christ!" he exclaimed. The floor was wet. It was more than wet, absolutely sodden. How had he not noticed? He could have sworn it was bone dry since this morning. Almost forgetting about the boy, Bill packed the unmarked homework into his briefcase and decided he wouldn't set any more homework for the rest of the year. Bill always let his mind wander in the chapel assemblies. It wasn't that he hated the chapel or speeches, but Mr. White, head of Year 11, was one of those men capable of saying quite a lot without actually saying anything. Bill started to feel slightly dizzy. Everything smelt damp, but it hadn't rained for days. He leant on an enormous stone column, trying to be subtle. Comforted by the cool and perfectly solid granite, Bill looked around to see if anyone was paying any attention to him. Nothing yet. It was then that he noticed, sitting right at the back, a small child. He was clearly much younger than Year 11. He was pale too, incredibly pale. Bill could almost make out cold blue blood vessels in his face. The child's hair was beyond lank. It was absolutely dripping, as was his uniform, and the whole bench for that matter. Black fungus had grown across it. The more he tried to look at the child, the more he could hear screams. They were distant, but getting closer, and he could tell they were the screams of the damned. The school bell rang, making Bill jump. Dismissing his form to their classes, he couldn't see the strange boy. Thinking about it, he was reminded of the figure in the doorway, almost as if he were being taunted. Bill had hardly slept last night. He couldn't stop thinking about the child. There seemed to be no escape in the school. Bill entered the library, almost instinctively ducking when he noticed the ceiling was lower, making him look taller. Mrs. Wilberforce looked small, even in the distorted world of the library. She popped up from behind a bookshelf with glasses, making her eyes look like tennis balls. "Morning, Mr. Foreman." "Foreman," Bill corrected her, not for the first time. "Returning those books?" "No, I wondered if you had any old school records." "Ah, how old are you talking?" "I think they go back to the 1890s, but there's a gap in the 70s. Bill pondered this, thinking about the boy. His uniform didn't have a school crest on it. "I'll just have a look at the older ones, if that's okay." Mrs. Wilberforce gestured for him to follow. Pulling a key from her lanyard, she unlocked an innocuous door at the back of the library. "Now, with some of the older records, most of the children were foundlings living here. A dark thought echoed in the back of Bill's mind. There are no children living here. Thanks, he said, and Mrs. Wilberforce left him to his business, assuming he taught history. Bill carefully opened a delicate box labelled December 1896 to January 1901. Pulling out a brown piece of paper labelled Punishment Records, Bill let out a soft gasp. They seemed absolutely draconian. Beatings and lashings just for asking a question without raising their hand. He then noticed that there was a newspaper clipping tucked into the box untidily. Pulling it out, Bill was worried that it might flake apart. It was a very brief obituary of a boy at the Foundling School. It didn't say anything about the cause of death, or even his name. All it said was that a boy had died one night at the school, and that the teachers were to hold a brief funeral in the chapel. This sounded apt. Bill tried to rifle through the records to see if he could find anything else about the boy's death, but there was nothing. The cupboard now seemed darker and colder. The box in his hand seemed like it was melting. It was wet. He looked around, and water was trickling through the walls. All the record boxes were turning into mulch and paste, and the floor was sodden. The water was quickly rising, soaking his feet. Bill started to hyperventilate, dropping the box into the water and clutching the walls. He had no choice and leapt out of the cupboard, slamming the door behind him. Catching his breath, he noticed his socks were dry. He didn't want to say anything about this, so he quickly walked out of the library, not saying anything to Mrs. Wilberforce as the school bell rang. Oh, you'll love this bit. A week had passed, and on every day at the school, Bill had seen the boy. The boy would always be watching him with those lifeless eyes, blank eyes, like a doll's eyes. Bill would stare right into them, and there was nothing but cries of fear in the back of his mind and screams all around him. Nothing in the world seemed to matter when Bill looked into those eyes. Bill was in a geography lesson with Year 10s. This class was always unruly, but today they were monstrous. He didn't even notice. He was simply standing at the front, unshaven, not having slept for 2 days, and clutching an enormous mug of coffee with 4 sugars. The small child was standing in the middle of the classroom. The carpet was completely soaked, and Bill could see his students' workbooks soaking up all the water that was on the desks. Not that they could see it. He was sick of it. This was a child ruining his life by staring at him. It festered in his mind, getting angrier and angrier, and he threw the mug. "What the fuck do you want?" he screamed. In what seemed like less than a blink of an eye, almost as if it never happened, the child was gone. Even worse, Bill had probably screwed up his career as a teacher. Poppy Murphy, quite possibly the only promising student in the class, was soaked in coffee with a bruise quickly forming on her temple. Bill was in deep shit. In the headmistress's office, Bill simply shrank into the chair as she tore into him. He was normally pleased to see Bella, with her severity and a twinkle. That twinkle was gone, and Bill didn't mention the dead child following him. "We can't tolerate this. I know you've been going through some shit with your divorce, but this is too bloody far. You're going to have to make an apology to both Poppy and her parents, and I'll write a statement saying that we mutually agreed to let you go," she said in an icy tone. But I didn't agree, Bill managed to release from his mouth. He wasn't sure how. It felt so dry that no words could possibly come out, and the icier Bella's voice became, the more it felt like her hands were squeezing round his throat. "You threw a mug at Poppy Murphy and screamed. You've basically agreed to leave." Bill couldn't protest, and he certainly couldn't tell her that he had been having visions of a child that nobody else could see, or the screams in his head. Submitting to the terms of his firing, Bill simply hid in his car for an hour. Once the school seemed deserted, he hurried back in. His classroom seemed like it no longer welcomed him. It was dark, and the pupils had left behind sweet wrappers on the desks and floor. What did it matter? It wasn't his classroom now. Bill unlocked and opened the desk drawer to collect his things. They were sodden. A couple of workbooks were effectively mulch, and his old iPod Touch was now completely inoperable. He scraped through to see if there was anything worth taking home. He hadn't felt or even seen the bottom of that drawer for years. It felt wrong. Something was scratched into the surface. Bill chucked out the books, sellotape, his stapler, and knickknacks acquired through the years. Carved into the wood were the words, "Help me," with a crudely drawn arrow next to them. He looked up from the arrow at the classroom door, and when he looked at exactly the right angle, through the window and through the corridor, he was looking directly at the school chapel. He didn't hesitate. He made an impulsive dash to the chapel. Twisting the brass doorknob, he was surprised to see it wasn't locked. Stepping inside, the chapel seemed more expansive and gloomier when the lights weren't on and nobody was inside. Now what? He paused for a moment and could hear them, the screams of the damned, loud enough that he could tell they were underneath him. The door to the crypt waited at the back of the chapel. It was locked, but the handle and hinges were old, iron and rusted. Bill gave it a kick. It juddered, but to no avail. He twisted the doorknob and pulled and pushed, but still nothing. Pausing, he reflected on his life. He had lost a job he once cared about. He lost his wife to someone he hated, and now he had a secret and futile crush on the headmistress. And bloody Mark Price was now his landlord. How the hell did that happen? The only things to keep Bill going were the mystery of the child and the prospect of tending to his garden. Twisting the doorknob, he battered the door with his shoulder. It was more painful than it looked on television, but Bill's anger kept him going. Who was going to see the bruises anyway? After a considerable battering and some bruising, the lock snapped and the door swung open. The crypt awaited. Bill pulled his phone out of his pocket and switched on the torch. Slowly making his way down a granite spiral staircase, echoes soon accompanied every trepidatious footstep. It felt like a long descent, even though Bill knew very certainly in his mind that this was a tiny staircase. His phone illuminated the water. The crypt was flooded. The room itself wasn't particularly big, but appeared cavernous in the dim light of the phone. The water was an inky black, sloshing back and forth. Bill briefly imagined that there might be a crocodile in there, waiting to kill anything that stepped in. Carefully placing his phone on the step, Bill steeled himself and went in. The chill shot up his spine. How was this not ice? He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He waded across the crypt. He could sense the screaming, now more like crying, scared, lonely crying. If it weren't for the great volume of water slowing him down, Bill would have stubbed his toe. He plunged his hands in, feeling the cold stone. The lid was heavy. With a shove, it budged. The sound of stone grinding against stone reverberated through the water and bounced around the crypt. Reaching down into the chest tomb, only Bill's head remained above the water. Hands blindly wandered in the black water until they touched something. It felt delicate. It was a small bone. Bill scooped up as many as he could. The first handful had a femur, a pelvis, and some vertebrae. He rushed back to the stairs and placed them by his phone. He went back and forth, collecting the other leg bones, some ribs, and the skull. He couldn't find any other bones, but he tried. They might have decomposed or somehow been lost in the decades spent in the cold down there. Conceding, he made his way back to the stairs. The torch on the phone had already switched off owing to the low battery. Using the dim light of the screen, he collected all the bones and took them upstairs. Bill dropped the child's bones on the floor of the chapel, dropped to his knees, fell on his side and shivered. Bill never saw the child after that night, and he never taught again. It was probably for the better. As for his garden, everything was going splendidly, and there was now something that was once a scared little boy sleeping in the flower bed. Merry Christmas.